Hello everyone! Today, I'm going over a budget commander deck that I've brewed around, the Mindskinner. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, including our basic lands at 10 cents each, but not including costs such as shipping. So, the Mindskinner is a 10-1 legendary nightmare costing 3 blue mana to cast, which can't be blocked, and has it so if a source you control would deal damage to an opponent. Instead, that damage is prevented, and each opponent mills that many cards. So this commander clearly wants to focus on emptying libraries as quickly as possible to force losses through trying to draw with no cards remaining. Basically putting everyone on a timer, though there's a few approaches we can take to lower the turns needed to empty those libraries. To start for this deck, we're going to look to include some other evasive creatures, such as those with flying, or ways to be unblockable to get some extra damage, and thus extra mill, during our combats. And given this is the kind of commander that could easily draw some ire from our opponents, it may be handy to keep a few back to help block some damage coming our way. Then of course there's plenty of spells that can force a target or each opponent to mill, or in some cases draw an overabundance of cards, since ultimately this deck is just looking to remove cards from the library and doesn't really care how they're removed. And while I didn't want to lean heavily into this avenue, we can use equipment to either increase the power of the Mindskinner, or to give keywords like Double Strike to make the time it does hit even more impactful. And honestly, I'm sure other deck builders have brewed this commander to basically be a mono blue Voltron. But regardless, let's get into the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. First up, there's Wayfarer's Bauble to let us tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped. And then we have Prismatic Lens and Mindstone as generic mana rocks, useful as we'll still have a bunch of spells that won't need specifically blue to cast. Sky Diamond, Silvermere, and Ornithopter of Paradise are each 2-drop blue producing mana sources, though you won't be able to access that mana until the next turn after they're cast. Then Arcane Signet will simply provide blue mana while entering the battlefield untapped. And finally, High Tide will give us access to a large mana boost for a single turn, making it so for the turn, players tapping an island for mana get an additional blue mana, and as we'll see later on, nearly all of our lands are just basic islands. But with that, let's start going into our various non-commander sources of mill to get those libraries emptied a bit faster. First up, Ruin Crab is a simple 1-drop that has each opponent mill 3 cards when a land enters the battlefield under your control, while Drowned Secrets has a target opponent mill 2 whenever you cast a blue spell, and Memory Erosion has opponents mill 2 whenever they cast a spell. Sphinx Mindbreaker is a 6/6 flyer that has each opponent mill 10 cards when it enters the battlefield, but that flying will make it quite evasive, and likely that you'll get that extra 6 damage off, or with the Mindskinner out, 6 extra milled cards. Then Fleet Swallower is also a 6/6, though with no inbuilt evasion. However, whenever it attacks, it has a target player put the top half of their library, rounded up, into their graveyard. And Fraying Sanity could really put a player on a short timer, as it enchants a player and then has that player mill X cards at the end of each end step, where X is the number of cards put into their graveyard from anywhere that turn. Then moving on to non-permanent spells, Drown in Dreams is an X cost spell that has you choose between a target player drawing X cards or milling twice X cards, but you can choose both if you wish if you control your commander. So it's fairly versatile, either having an opponent remove 3 times X spent through draw and mill, or if we need cards in hand, we can cast this targeting ourselves and only choose the draw mode. Mind Sculpt has a target opponent mill 7 for 2 mana, and Fractured Sanity has each opponent mill 14 cards, though this could be cycled away, where in that case each opponent has to mill 4 instead. While Traumatize and Cut Your Losses has a target player mill the top half of their library, rounded down, with Cut Your Losses having Casualty 2, where if you sack a creature with power 2 or greater while casting it, you can copy the spell, and you can choose new targets. Fascination is another X cost spell, having either everyone draw X or have everyone mill X. And while it's not exactly mill, forcing draw is still getting cards out of an opponent's library and still works on the overall game plan, so I have Forced Fruition in here as well, which has it so whenever an opponent casts a spell, they draw 7 cards. Now I'd like to go over a smattering of creature cards that will generally help progress the game plan in one way or another, starting with Soulless Jailer, which makes it so permanents in graveyards can't enter the battlefield and players can't cast non-creature spells from their graveyard or exile, which will help keep the cards we're getting milled in the yard and counter any reanimation decks we might be up against. Chasm Skulker and Undead Alchemist can help us fill our boards with creatures, which may be helpful in guarding our life total, as this deck could definitely draw some aggression, with the former getting a +1/+1 counter whenever you draw, and you make X 1/1 blue squid creature tokens with Island Walk when it dies, with X being the number of +1/+1 counters on it. And then the latter making a 2/2 zombie creature token whenever a creature card is put into an opponent's graveyard from their library, while also technically being a source of mill, as your zombies that deal damage instead have that opponent mill that many cards, so this at least works for a game plan if our commander is currently missing in action. Then Esior, Windwing Familiar, is a 1/3 with flying, so yay, an evasive damage source, but it also helps us protect our commander a bit, as Esior basically gives it Ward 3. Then Tempest Djinn is a flyer with 4 toughness, but it gets +1 power for each basic land you control. And Jace's Phantasm is a low drop 1/1 flyer, but it gets +4/+4 so long as an opponent has 10 or more cards in their graveyard. Vantra's Gargoyle is a 5/4 flyer only costing 2 mana, but it can't attack unless an opponent has 7 cards in their graveyard and can't block unless you have 4 or more cards in hand. But that attacking prerequisite should be very easiest for us to achieve through our commander. And finally, Stuffy Doll is an indestructible creature that has you choose a player when it enters the battlefield, and whenever Stuffy Doll is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to the chosen player. So, an amazing blocker for this deck, while it can also be tapped to deal 1 damage to itself. Now, I didn't dive too deeply into equipment in this deck as I really didn't want to go Voltron, but there are a few in this deck which I'd like to mention. Fire Shrieker simply gives its equipped creature double strike, while Inquisitor's Flail has its equipped creature deal double the damage that it would normally do, though it also technically takes double the damage if a creature would block it. So for our commander though, this both just means doubling up the damage / mill that we'd be causing. And then for power increases, we have Blackblade Reforged and Bone Horde, the former giving its equipped creature +1/+1 for each land you control, and the latter giving it +X/+X, with X being the number of creature cards in all graveyards, which could be a huge amount depending on the decks that you're up against and how much milling you've managed to do already. Now I'd like to go over a bunch of interaction spells, and some protection spells, as this is the kind of commander I suspect will get itself or its player targeted in most pods. Starting with some ways to protect our commander, outside of Esior, Champion's Helm and Curator's Ward are both ways to give our commander hexproof, with the former also giving its equipped creature +2/+2, while Turn Aside is a counterspell that targets a spell targeting a permanent that we control, but it only costs 1 mana to do this. And then we have a bunch of more general counterspells, starting with Counterspell, just generally countering a spell. Long River's Pull at base counters a creature spell, but it can counter any spell if you gift a card to an opponent, which, hey, that is technically 1 less card in their library. Spell Rupture is pretty solid in this deck, as it counters a target spell unless its controller pays X, with X being the greatest power among creatures you control. So, it's at least pay 10 if we have our commander out with no equipment on it. Then we have Negate to counter a non-creature spell. Don't Make a Sound, which is probably the spell that you need to be the most timely with casting, as it's a general counterspell, but it can be prevented if the opponent pays 2. But at least if they do, you get to Surveil 2. But moving to slightly more mana expensive counters, Ice Out is a general counterspell that can have its mana cost reduced by 1 if you sack an artifact, enchantment, or token when casting. Unwind counters a non-creature spell and then lets you untap up to 3 lands, so it can basically repay itself. Dissolve counters a spell and has you scry 1 for 3. While Thought Collapse and Didn't Say Please counter a target spell and then have its controller mill 3. Then Raven Form is a bit of removal, exiling a target artifact or creature, though its controller gets a 1/1 bird token with flying. And now moving on to a bit more protection for our own life totals. Dissipation Field has it so whenever a permanent deals damage to you, it's returned to its owner's hand, so making it unattractive to attack us. Crawl Space makes it so no more than 2 creatures could attack us each combat. And Propaganda makes it so creatures can't attack us unless their controller pays 2 mana for each creature attacking you, so making it expensive to attack us. And then Blue isn't really well known for its good board wipes, especially at a budget, but Scourge of the Fleet is a 6/6, so another potential source of damage / mill, that has each creature your opponents control with toughness equal to or less than the number of islands we control returned to their owner's hand. And then Aetherize returns all attacking creatures to their owner's hand at instant speed, so it could really mess with somebody trying to swing big damage our way. But with that, it's time to go over the spells that we can use to help keep us from top decking. First up, Endless Atlas can give us some consistent draw across turns, as it can be tapped to draw 2, provided you have 3 or more lands with the same name. While Chart of Course has its draw 2, but then you discard 1 unless you attack that turn, though we should be doing that basically any turn we have our commander out and able. Muldrifter is a 2/2 flyer that has you draw 2 when it enters the battlefield, but it can be evoked for a lower cost if you just want the draw. And Concentrate simply has its draw 3. Traverse Eternity has its draw cards equal to the highest mana value of historic permanents we control, so at least 3 with our commander out. And then our last sorcery speed draw spell here is Windfall, which also acts as a bit of force draw, as it has each opponent discard their hand and then draw cards equal to the greatest number of cards discarded this way. And then at instant speed, we have Quick Study to draw 2, Into the Store to draw 4, though its cost is reduced by 3 generic if an opponent has 7 or more cards in their graveyard. Then Flow of Knowledge has you draw a card for each island you control and then discard 2. And finally, we have Pull from Tomorrow, Even the Score, and Commander's Insight, X cost spells that has us draw at least X cards, as Commander's Insight has that player draw an additional card for each time their commander was cast from their command zone that game. But now that we've gone through all of the spells in this deck, let's quickly go over our land base, of which there's only a few distinct cards to talk about, with War Room and Bonder's Enclave being a couple of extra potential sources of draw, and Myriad Landscape, which we can sack to tutor 2 basic lands onto the battlefield tapped. But aside from that, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 32 basic islands. But now that we've gone through all 100 cards in this deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing for just under $45 at the time of recording, which does include our basic lands at 10 cents each, but wouldn't include costs such as shipping. And before closing out this video, I'd like to suggest a few cards that you may wish to consider if you're wanting to build this deck with a bit higher budget. First up, Brewvac the Grandiloquent basically makes all of our mill twice as effective, though note that the effect causing mill does have to say mill specifically either on the card or having it eroded in. Psychic Corrosion will make everyone else mill too whenever we draw. Tasha's Hideous Laughter makes each opponent mill until they've milled at least 20 mana values worth of cards. And Maddening Cacophony makes each opponent mill 8, but if it was kicked, each opponent instead mills half their library rounded up. Archive Trap will make somebody mill 13, while we also have a potential way to cast it for free, and Mind Crank makes it so any life loss will lead to mill instead of just the damage that we'd be doing. Though honestly, this one might just make you even more of a target, or the only target, at the pod at that point. Then Zelix Sanity Flayer is definitely a bit more costly, but can really fill out our board state, as it makes a 1/1 horror creature token whenever an opponent mills a creature card, while also being a source of mill itself. Then Mjolnir, Stormhammer, gets freely equipped onto a legendary creature when entering the battlefield, and has a bit of interaction tapping down something when its equipped creature attacks, while also potentially dealing a bunch of damage applied to each opponent, which just means more milling. Grafdigger's Cage is another way to shut down reanimation decks outside of our Soulless Jailer, and Silent Arbiter can help keep us from being swarmed, though it does slow down the game overall. And the last card I'm going to suggest here is Visions of Beyond, which for this deck is effectively just a 1-drop draw 3 spell, as getting an opponent to have 20 cards in their graveyard shouldn't be a massive hurdle for this deck. But with that, if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link as always is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like, and maybe drop a sub if you'd like more budget commander decks in your feeds. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.